Okay.
Hi, everybody. Are we unmuted?
Yes,
yeah.
you're
Okay.
right.
Hi, this is Rebecca at IRH. I am going to welcome you all and get us started with, we're going to do some introductions with everyone in the room and then those on the line as we all settle in here. Hope you are all settled in with snack or coffee or lunch, as the case may be. Why don't we start with Brian and go. Speak up so the people online can hear.
So I have some food in my mouth. Brian Shaw. I'm a senior research officer at the Institute for Reproductive Health.
I'm Christina Riley. I'm a research officer also for Institute for Reproductive Health.
Kiara Berkey, I'm a program officer at Masters.
I'm Courtney McLarnon. I'm a program officer at IRH.
I am Leah Hill, and I'm a research officer on the FACT project.
I'm Hanley Holtz. I'm a program associate on the FACT project.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leah Sata. I'm a program associate on the Passages project and the Learning Collaborative.
Leah, I'm going to hold on. Leah, do you want to ask people online or just maybe say who's online?
Yes, so I am seeing Dominic, Lauren, Miriam Temin, Sandra, Usha Vatsya, and then I don't have full names here, but I have someone named Saori, and then I have codes.
All right, thanks. Well, welcome to everyone online.
I think there's a few other people that were now at the table.
So,
yeah, I can go. Hi, I'm Esther Spindler, research officer under FACT and Breakthrough Research Project.
I'm Angela Foley, a senior research officer on Passages.
And maybe then we can introduce Joseph.
Okay.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. No. Okay. Hi, my name is Joseph Petralia. I'm director of Syntegral. Formerly, not so long ago, I was senior behavior change advisor at Pathfinder International. I still live in Boston, but our offices are here. Don't know what more to say at this point. Maybe in the question and answer period, I'll think of more sort of relevant. I know something that might be kind of relevant even at this stage. My background is actually in cognitive science and rhetoric. So both of those are kind of the study of how people tap information and use information to build a representation of issues. Okay, so it's not as odd a combination as one might think. And I say that now because I think it kind of maybe informs a little bit about how I approach the issue of adaptation and some of the claims I'm going to make about adaptation, because I really do approach a lot of work in public health from a kind of cognitive perspective.
Thanks. So I have seen or heard Joseph speak a few times recently around adaptation and scale up and complexity, and I thought it was really interesting thinking and something super relevant to all of us at IRH. So I felt sad that more people from our office hadn't had the opportunity to hear him speak and maybe have a little discussion about some of his ideas. So and I know most of you, I think I know all of you, but I can tell who you are on the phone. And I know that there's a mix of program and research folks, but I think all of us have a particular interest in scale up and the issues around complexity and adaptation. So I think that's what they want to hear about. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And I just want to thank again Rebecca for helping make this possible, and for Leah for all the assistance she's given in also doing the logistics to make everything possible. I think in the little blurb I provided on what this was going to be about, I want to talk briefly about what I'm calling the complexity-scalability dilemma, but I think we're all, whether we call it that or not, we're all kind of familiar with that, the dilemma. I want to get into sort of adaptation as a way of how we bridge complexity and scalability. And I just want to note that I know that we all adapt all the time. Probably you've adapted 20 times before you've even come into work today, right? You've had to adjust your schedule. You've had to deal with, somebody who didn't do what you expected them to do, and you had to come up with a plan B. So adaptation is something we do all the time. It's not an insight to say that adaptation is how we get from point A to point B. But I think we sometimes see adaptation as a kind of a necessary evil, something we have to do in order to get around an obstacle. And instead, I think we can think of adaptation in a more positive, more strategic and proactive way. And yet I think in public health, we often haven't had the sort of tools and the thinking necessary to approach adaptation in that way. So instead we approach adaptation as kind of like, well, what do we do now to sort of put our finger in the dike, or, you know, hold back something sort of disastrous. So most of this presentation is going to be focused on how do we see adaptation more positively, and what would it take to create a more sort of proactive and positive notion of adaptation. And if there are questions online, I think we mentioned this before, please feel free to put questions in the box and we'll get to those at the end. And I don't know if it makes sense, Rebecca, if anybody has a question that they want to ask during, if they're really pressing. Yeah, I mean, if there's a pressing question, maybe you could like say, stop please, I want to ask for something, and we will stop. Don't mind being interrupted at all. So this is what I think the dilemma is, right? And it's kind of the unmovable object, unstoppable force paradox that we've talked about in other contexts. You know, you have this new complexity thinking, systems thinking. Everybody's talking about this these days. Everybody's talking about context. And everybody's realizing that really you need to have highly localized solutions to local problems, right? And as I say, I don't think that's a fad. I think this is here to stay. I think we're understanding that, you know, working locally, working within the local situation, the local complexities is critical. At the same time, as we know, in the industry, the need for scale up is also not going away. For lots of reasons, donors, implementing organizations want to be able to have a way of making sure that their best practice is disseminated as widely and efficiently as possible. And for me, this creates an interesting kind of tension, right? As I say below, we're expected to be responsive to local realities, while at the same time, we're expected to import principles and practices that have demonstrated success elsewhere, right? So how do we do that? And the answer is, you know, obviously, perhaps, adaptation, okay? But in order to discuss adaptation, I first want to start with complexity, because I said it's part of the equation. It's part of what creates the paradox. The fact that the implementation environments that we face are highly complex. And public health, I mean, it's complex in any field, but I think public health is if not unique, it's special in that it's sort of the convergence of the biomedical, the social, the international often in the work that we do, the interpersonal. It brings together a lot of different, not independent systems of complexity, but overlapping systems of complexity in a unique way. So I want to talk a little bit about complexity, because that's what demands adaptation, and that's what's required, as we've already mentioned, for scaling things up, right? We have to adapt in order to scale, but I think we also have to adapt in order to sustain whatever impact we're having right now. That is, if we have a program that's being really successful and it's doing well, it also needs to adapt because it's moving through time and it's moving through different circumstances. And if it's going to sustain that success, it's going to have to adapt to those factors as well. So, but let me start at the beginning with complexity, and let me offer a what I call a working or workable definition of complexity. And there's lots of, you read any of the complexity literature out there, of which there is a lot, all sorts of models of complexity coming out of computer science and engineering and management studies, and cognitive science, God knows, has lots of complexity models. For implementers such as us, I think there are three major components that make our work particularly complex. And these I describe as sort of the landscape dimension of complexity, the temporal dimension, and the final interpretive dimension, which I think is particularly important. So let me quickly sort of talk about what I think these three dimensions are. And again, this is meant as sort of the program implementer's model of complexity. So this doesn't do for lots of other fields, but I think it's useful for ours. So the landscape dimension I think, is really all of those things that normally we think of as context, right? And for some people, context and complexity are the same thing. And I'm going to argue that they're kind of not. Context is a big part of it, but it's not the whole thing. To illustrate that landscape dimension, I'm raising something that some of you might be familiar with. This is the CFR, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, that Laura Damschroeder and her colleagues have developed. It's very popular in implementation science. It looks at all of these different contextual variables that differ from project to project. And I'm not going to go through this. I just wanted to throw this up there just to say this is kind of what I mean by a landscape, right? All of these different contextual variables that accompany any attempt at implementation. If people want references to any of this, please don't hesitate to ask. Why that context isn't sufficient, that landscape context, is because there's also this temporal dimension as well. So it's not just that we have all those things, but we have things that are happening at time 0, time 1, time 2, time 3. And every time, or at every interval of time, there's a constant reconfiguring of all of these variables. We're having to make them all fit across time, right? So I think we're very comfortable with these first two dimensions. The landscape, we're all comfortable with as context. Temporal, we all know that's why we do longitudinal work, is because we know things change over time. But I think something that we don't do as much with as we need to when we think about complexity, and something I work a lot with, is what I call this interpretive dimension. I think a better word for it is constructivist, but I've given a variation of this presentation a few times, and some people say, I have no idea what you mean by constructivist. So I realize that it's kind of something that I know a lot about, but it's something that that everybody might not talk about. And basically, it really is just how we negotiate meaning through language and social interaction, right? We all come to any issue, any problem, and this is the cognitive scientist in me speaking, we all come to any issue or problem with prior experience. And we all think we understand the problem based on that prior experience. And yet we all have different prior experience, right? So we're all coming to the same problem from different perspectives, and we understand that. But that means that we're always having to negotiate what we mean when we say X. And we don't do that very explicitly, because that would take up all of our time, right? Every meeting we would attend, we would just be talking about our different interpretations about what it was that Leah said. She made a comment, and Rebecca thought it meant this, Brian thought it meant that, right? So we all have different stakes, motives, and prior experience, and this requires us to interpret what's being said, and this adds a critical dimension to complexity. I think maybe the biggest dimension of complexity. To talk a little bit more about that, think about all the tasks that we do that are rarely ever undertaken only by you, right? Almost everything we do is taken as part of a team. We say those tasks are distributed, right? Distributed across many different people who are participating in the task, who are understanding the task in slightly different ways, and we're not talking about it. But it's going on, but we don't really flag that. I think programs run on, that should say text, or programs are textual. It can't be both. What I mean by that is that if we think about it, all of the projects we do, and I think everybody here really knows this for a fact, because our organizations document everything. And yet we only document the things that we think are important, right? We don't document things that we think are kind of peripheral, or maybe they didn't even come to our consciousness. Or maybe the thing that is documented is something that the lead researcher thought was important and none of the other researchers thought were important. Or the other researchers kind of knew, well, no, that was kind of fluffy. I'm not sure that I would have said that. But the lead researcher did, okay? But the fact is it gets committed to text, right? And we run on text. I mean, this is how donors know what we're doing. This is how we know what we're doing. This is how we're able to interpret data. And that's all being encoded based on our interpretations. And all of these first two are really important because all of our decisions as implementers and as stakeholders are based on our representation, our understanding, what's in our heads about what this project is about. And again, all of us have a different representation of the same project. It's not the same project for all of us. Some of us find this aspect interesting, this aspect not so interesting. Some of us are more interested in these dynamics. Some people aren't even looking at those dynamics. Okay, so this is why this interpretive dimension is so critical to complexity, is because we spend a lot of time without thinking about it. We spend a lot of time trying to negotiate and iron out basically different understandings of what the project is. So putting it all together, programmatic activities are not only complex because there's so many elements in the landscape, so many pieces of context that are constantly shifting over time and recalibrating to one another, but also because our ability to share and assess those with others in our organization, as well as with other stakeholders, is dependent on language and interpretation. Okay, so that's sort of complexity 101. So going back to complexity, that complexity is what requires the adaptation and what is necessary for sustained impact and scale. So now I want to talk about what kind of adaptation that requires. And here I think adaptation is really a foundation for scale up. And I think this is a point that Rebecca wanted me to bring up, is we have a lot of models of scale up. And Rebecca, many others participate in a community of practice surrounding scale up. I'm most familiar with the ExpandNet methodology, but I'm familiar with the others as well. I know Rebecca's deeply involved in ExpandNet as well. And it's a really interesting approach to scale up. It's really based on what I call mechanisms. Okay, that is, it tells you what needs to happen, who needs to participate in different things. It's very procedural in some sense. And that's important, and that's super useful. What those structural scale-up methodologies don't always entail is the fact that there's a management system that has to permit that, right? In order for any of these scale-up strategies, whether it's MSI or ExpandNet or any of the other big scale-up methodologies, all of those assume that managers are able to assess where they are in a project and to make adjustments and to make changes, and they're able to manage in an adaptive way. And adaptive management is a thing, right? I mean, we read about adaptive management quite a bit. Well, I say that, and yet a lot of people have said, I've never really encountered that before. Are there people for whom adaptive management is kind of a new thing? Or have people seen that? People have seen some reference to it. There's a literature out there. I think it's often some of the most interesting stuff's coming from the UK rather than the US, but there's a very robust literature of adaptive management out there, which I think is neglecting its own foundation, which is adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is, as I say here, cognition focused. It's every implementer's, every stakeholder's ability to think adaptively. If we don't have an ability to sort of think adaptively, we can't really be partners in adaptive management. We're going to have managers making all the choices, all of the decisions, based on what they think is going on. And they're going to tap us, us being people in the field, people actually on the front lines. They're going to tap us, but we're not really going to be partners. They're going to be tapping us for information that they need to make decisions. When in fact, I think adaptation requires everybody to be on board and to know something about adaptation and to be able to be a partner in adaptation. So this is what I mean when I think adaptation, these lower two parts are necessary for scale up. I don't think scale up can happen if you don't have adaptive management and adaptive capacity. So I think I've already just said this, adaptive capacity, which is what Syntegral does. My consultancy really is focused on how do we help build the ability to translate knowledge and critical thinking about complexity and adaptation into context-sensitive implementation behavior. The other idea here that I think we're all involved in to some extent, is the adaptive management approach, which is an intentional approach to making decisions and adjustments in response to new information and changes in context, right? So these are the two kind of adaptation pieces of the puzzle, right? So we have complexity, that three-part model requires adaptation, and these are what we kind of mean by adaptation, adaptive capacity and adaptive management, and these are the basis, the foundation for the scale up that we're looking for. An explicit focus on adaptation's contribution to scale up will balance the need to fit an intervention to other contexts without sacrificing what we consider to be core in a particular project. We need adaptation or adaptive thinking to accommodate systems and culture-related factors within a scaled program that might inhibit resilience and sustainability. We need an adaptation to guide an understanding of the context of implementation, both at the original site where the practice, the model practice was developed, as well as be able to contrast that to how's that going to look in this new site. So this worked in this site, in this context of implementation. What are the other sites of, what are the other contexts of implementation that this is going to have to accommodate itself to? We want to be able to identify contextual elements most susceptible to volatility and variability that permits anticipation of practical workarounds. So we as implementers want to be able to anticipate what's going to be most likely to change, or what seems most questionable in our work plan, in our proposal, etc. And we all, again, I think we all think this. I mean, we're all considering these things when we write proposals, when we develop work plans, but we don't make it very explicit. So it always seems to like surprise us when it happens. It's like, who thought that was going to happen? Well, maybe we should have, right? So this is just a way of sort of priming us for what we know is going to happen. We know the plan is going to change. And finally, I think both adaptive capacity and adaptive management techniques pull frontline workers, again, people on the ground, into the decision-making process. Because a big thing about adaptive management is real-time data collection and real-time data analysis. And this is usually done by, again, those adaptive managers who are tapping people on the ground to get them the data. And by that data, they often mean like service usage. They mean, often very quantitative data. What they're not tapping in the frontline workers is, what do you guys think? What do you think is happening? What's going on locally? What do you think is causing people to be either taking up services or not taking up services? What are the shifts that are going on that you see, because you're the eyes and ears and brains on the ground? What is it that you see that is explaining what it is, what we're finding in our research? And I think adaptive managers need to know that. And for that to happen, frontline has to be a partner rather than just a source of information. Okay, so that pulls them into this decision-making process. I think it promotes participation and ownership, and again, it makes scale-up more resilient. Something that's been interesting to me as I've done different sort of talks places is people talk a lot about the challenge, big challenge to resilience that they see is that so much is invested in a few individuals in an organization. And then when those people leave, you're up the creek, right? Because they're taking all of this knowledge with them. So when you don't have like a broad adaptive capacity within an organization or within a project, it's really hurting sustainability and resilience of the project. So again, this is, I think, what the contribution of adaptive capacity is. So this is what I think of as kind of, again, the cognitive science term would be a mediating theory, but this is what sort of links all of these different elements that link complexity to adaptation to quality and to scale. I think if you start at the top with a heightened attention to complexity, that can, through different processes, you can transform that into shared meaning making and proactive questioning, again, to address that interpretive dimension of complexity. We can make ourselves all, I mean, not just at the front line, but even at headquarters level, stakeholder level, et cetera, we can all be better, more proactive about asking questions. I taught for many, many years at Georgia Tech, and I would give a lecture that I even thought I did a really bad job of. I must have confused everybody. And at the end, I would say, are there any questions? And there would be no questions. It's like, really? There are no, I did such a good job that there are no questions. And students were either being polite or weren't paying attention, would like nod. And I think we don't have a very good skill at encouraging people to ask questions. People feel like if they ask a question and nobody else is asking questions, they're going to reveal themselves as uniquely unaware of what the heck you were talking about, when in fact nobody knew what the heck you were talking about. But nobody wants to signal, nobody wants to sort of challenge you, nobody wanted to say, really, you didn't make that point very clearly, could you repeat that again, right? Because they don't know how to do that in a polite way. And this really impacts our ability to adapt our programs, right? Is this inability to get people to ask questions and to negotiate these different understandings of what's happening. I think if we do that, can we shut that off? Yeah. Or is it on mine? Is she?
Let's try and like minimize
Oh,
that.
okay, great. Thanks. That's fine. That's good. Thank you. So if we can develop that capacity to ask good questions and be proactive, that will lead, or that will support, the application of adaptive skills and systems, which will also help adaptive management and create context-appropriate interventions, which contributes to greater programmatic impact and sustainable scale-up, which creates a deeper understanding of a project's dynamic theory of change, which again will lead back into a heightened sense of complexity. So it's kind of a virtuous cycle here. That idea of a dynamic theory of change is another idea that we work with a lot at Syntegral. And we want people to have a theory of change as a jumping off point, as a starting point. But if you have a learning agenda and you're doing research, if your theory of change at the end of the project is the same as it is at the beginning of the project, we're doing something wrong, right? I mean, the whole point of having a learning agenda is because we're learning more about how this program works, what the dynamics are, you know, landscape, temporal, interpretive. We're learning more about those things, and that's going to impact our theory of change. So we need a dynamic theory of change. And again, this is part of building adaptive capacity, is making sure that people know that it's really good that our theory of change will change. That's how we demonstrate that we've learned something from having done the project.
Don't you feel sometimes people kind of get tied to the theory of change because it becomes like those, you know, that core mission or the core goal of the project?
The log frame kind of, yeah.
They kind of break it.
Absolutely.
Stick to that too much.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's absolutely what I think a major problem is that's what we give most of our colleagues to go from, is we're going to have these inputs, they're going to produce these outputs, they're going to have these results, and we're going to get to these outcomes and impacts. And because that's what they have, they don't kind of look left, they don't right. They don't realize that this has nothing to do with what we're actually doing on the ground. The reality on the ground is so much more complicated than that, but this is what we have. This is what we're going to write our reports on, right? These are the indicators we promised the donor, so now we're going to have to like just report on these, when in fact we should maybe be saying to the donors, and I think donors would like to hear, actually, we're learning in the process of doing this that some of the things we thought were going to be important indicators maybe are going to be less important, and some things that we didn't attend to we're finding are very important. So we're, you know, it's going to be an ongoing dialogue with our donors and others in the organization. But I think, yeah, that's exactly the problem. I think when you don't have adaptive capacity, you have people sticking to the plan even when the plan's not working, right? But we all pretend, there's the joke that they used to have in the Soviet Union that, you know, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, right? I think it's funnier in Russian. I don't know. But the idea that, we pretend like we're sticking to the plan and donors pretend like they believe that we're sticking to the plan, when in fact we all know that the complexity on the ground is so much different than what we're seeing in the documentation, right? So we're all kind of participating in this kind of fiction. And this is not responding. Any ideas? Oh, maybe I didn't click on the right thing. Thank you. So now I want to move on, and I'll try to cover this kind of quickly because I want to get to questions and answers. These are, I've made a big deal about why I think adaptation is critical and why I think this adaptive capacity is really critical for adaptive management and for scale. So I want to sort of suggest there's a number of tools that can help us build that adaptive capacity, because I think that's the next question. It's like, okay, we're convinced adaptive capacity is important. We need to be thinking adaptively. What can we do about that? This is a little board game called What Could Possibly Go Wrong? And it's a kind of game we play with a group of implementers who all know what a project is, and they play it based on the project they're working on. And it's asking them, I'm not going to go into detail, but those little squares represent the landscape, temporal, and structivist dimensions. And as they land on different squares, they have to think, gee, what was an area of interpretation that we didn't get right? Or what was an area of the context that we didn't include? Or how did things change over time that we weren't aware of? And it gets people really thinking that every project that we've worked on has these three dimensions of complexity. The little purple things are horizontal and vertical scale up. So when you land on those questions, you think about horizontal and vertical scale up challenges that you have in that particular project.
They're cards for this?
No, this is a board game.
So
you roll a dice, and your team, So you play this game, and then you have a discussion among yourself.
But are the discussion questions triggered by the little icons there,
Yes.
or by cards?
By the icons. Yeah, you don't need cards. If you land on one of the bluer squares, that's something that's not a volatile issue. If it's the redder square, it's a more volatile. So I'd love to talk about this game. It's an interesting game to play both at different levels, at implementer levels, at headquarters levels, at administration levels in the country. But too much about that already, sorry. Something that I think Rebecca saw me do a kind of dog and pony show in Bali on is a Koya analysis. This is a context of implementation and adaptation, which is a tool, as I've said before, that profiles what the model context of implementation was and what issues they faced when they first implemented this model practice. And based on that profile of what that model practice looked like and the context that shaped that model practice, you can then do that same analysis on future contexts. And then that gives you a basis for comparing what is different about this context than the original context for which this was originally designed, right? So that's what a Koya analysis does. Same page is a set of tools not developed by Syntegral. These are out there because there's a lot of work being done in linguistics, in education, that are really trying to get question raising, skills building, ability to get clarification, to ask critical questions, challenging other people's assumptions. These reflect Rogerian ideas of argumentation. And briefly, Rogerian argument is just, I make sure that you appreciate that I understand what you're saying before I counter what you're saying, right? So you're assured that I'm listening to you before I just sort of jump in and we just argue back and forth. You need to know that I heard what you said, but here's what I think I would say to that. And then you do the same for me. So we try to build this kind of very constructive, productive Rogerian idea. And again, this is a series of tools called Same Page because we're trying to get people onto the same page. Really critical to address complexity. There's this model called FRAME, which is, I said before that adaptive management often requires the input of ongoing data on the project in real time. And FRAME is a way that we get that information from the front line. So this is frontline aggregated monitoring and evaluation. We very rapidly, we're doing this in Niger right now, once a week, people in the field, in communities out in Zinder, in the east of the country, are getting phone calls that are asking them these 10 questions in the local language, and they just respond to 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. And after a period of time on these different elements of how is the intervention going, we start to see trends. And then supervisors can see these immediately, in like once every 2 months, you've got 8 different sort of data points, right? You're starting to see some trends here. The whole purpose of that is not because that's telling you exactly how the implementation is going, but it's giving you a basis to have a conversation with the frontline workers and to say, this is what we're seeing about how community acceptance of the project is going. As we see, it started very high, and we're seeing there seems to be a trend that's kind of leveling off, or it's kind of maybe drifting a little low. Why is that? And the whole point of this is to give the supervisor the opportunity to ask the questions that we often don't get a chance to ask our frontline workers is, what are you seeing that explains how you think the project is going? Okay, so it's not like your typical real-time data, which is often about, again, numbers like service uptake, etc. This is really a more, you know, what are frontline workers seeing? What are they feeling about the project? And the questions they're asked, they're just 10 questions, they're very short. They differ from project to project, but it's a way of getting answers to that very, very quickly and provoking this kind of a conversation to build adaptive capacity. A few other things that I think do that is, we've already talked about that. That's the what could possibly go wrong game. There's an exercise called problem space. It's a participatory learning activity that helps people identify core elements, what's really critical versus what's flexible. And I think in front lines often aren't as used to being asked to reflect on that. They're given their marching orders. To them, it's just a series of things they need to do. And this gives them an opportunity to think about, well, what's really critical here? What would we prioritize as core versus what's not so, it's not so critical to do it exactly this way. There may be other ways of doing that, and how are other ways of doing that? So it's kind of working through what we call a problem space. And I think the last thing I'm talking about here is another exercise we call second loop. Are people familiar with the single loop and double loop conversation? Yeah, it's an interesting conversation started by Chris Argyris, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his last name, who talked about traditionally, and he wrote this like 30 years ago. I mean, it's kind of old stuff. I didn't know until I actually looked up when this first came about. But 30 years ago, he wrote this really excellent piece that has really taken on in implementation science these days. Single loop learning is what you learn when you've set that, you know, these are our hypotheses that we've set at the beginning of the project. And basically, we want to learn how to reach those endpoints. So we're collecting the indicators, we're, you know, doing the evaluation of those indicators, and the whole goal is to see, are we reaching that end that we promised we were going to reach? That's what he calls single loop learning. Once we find out if we're reaching those indicators or not, then that feeds back into the program and we improve the program. So it's a typical program improvement process. You know, are we doing what we said we were going to do? No. Okay, what can we learn from that and how can we do it better? A double loop learning is a little bit different in that not only do you ask those single loop questions, because we have to ask those, but he says, what assumptions about the program are changing? What have we learned? And this is the more contemporary discussion we're having on a learning agenda. When you hear people talk about a learning agenda, they're talking about this double loop, right? not just are you reaching what you said you were going to reach at the beginning of the proposal, but what are you learning about the problem, about the population, about the